Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Patriot Party, where truth, transparency, and constitutional principles come before politics. The Patriot Party movement is focused on re-empowering we the people, restoring accountability, and putting America first through honest conversations and real solutions. Today's conversation sits at the intersection of education, tax dollars, data transparency, and accountability in public systems. My guest today is Christopher Papst, a national Emmy-winning investigative reporter who spent 8 years examining why Baltimore City spends $1.7 billion annually on public schools, yet only about 10% of students test proficient in math. His work earned national recognition and sparked federal-level policy discussion, and it raises a larger question: if this is happening in one city, where else is it happening? Christopher, welcome to the Patriot Party. Glad to have you here.
Thank you for having me on. I appreciate it.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. So you didn't start out to write a book. You set out to investigate a question. What originally triggered your investigation into Baltimore schools, and what didn't make sense?
So in 2016, I was working as an investigative reporter in Washington, D.C., working for the ABC News affiliate. And I got a call from the parent company of the ABC News affiliate, which is Sinclair Broadcast Group. And they said, hey, do you want to come to Baltimore, come to Fox 45, just go about 45 miles northeast, and start this thing called Project Baltimore? And what Project Baltimore is that we are a team of five. We're two photographer editors, two producers, and myself as the reporter. And the concept was, which is a pretty interesting concept in local news, is that we were going to be a team of five that investigates one topic. And in January of 2017, we launched Project Baltimore, and the one topic was public education. And we started in Baltimore City, and since then we've sort of spread out to cover the entire state of Maryland. But the book Failure Factory that I wrote covers just 2017 to 2025, those years, and it's mostly Baltimore City. But what is happening in Baltimore City, we know is happening throughout the entire country. And what that is massive amounts of funding keep getting put into public schools. But what we're not getting as taxpayers, and what the students are not getting, are better educational outcomes. So in 2017, we set out to answer the questions: how and why is this happening? And in my book Failure Factory, I think that after 9 years, we have figured out why and how it's happening, and that's why I wrote the book, to let other people know.
Okay. Okay. Well, I mean, that's figuring it out is half the battle. Now we got to do it, right? Fix it.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. So Baltimore spends roughly, I think it was 1.7 billion annually on education. Where does that money actually go? Break it down for us.
Sure. So I can go over how that money has changed, and then we'll go over like exactly where it's going. So the book starts in 2017, and it goes, and we now have the most recent data came out a couple weeks ago. So the book goes from 2017 to 2024. That was the data that we had when the book came out a couple months ago. But now we have 2025 data, so we can update it. And that's the thing about like the public education and what we're doing, is that we can continue to update it, but as we update it, the only thing that gets better is the funding. So in 2017, Baltimore City Schools had a $1.3 billion budget. In 2025, 8 years later, the city had a $1.8 billion budget. So it got a $500 million increase in funding a year, comes out to about 38%. So let's talk about graduation rates. In 2017, the graduation rate in Baltimore City Schools was 70%. 8 years later, in 2025, with a 38% increase in funding, it went up 1 point. It went to 71%, both by far the lowest in the state of Maryland. In 2017, there were 11% of the students in the entire school system were proficient in math, meaning 89% of kids in Baltimore City Schools in 2017 were not proficient in math. So the state and the government put in a 38% funding increase over 8 years, and now 12% of kids are proficient in math. So a 1% increase in graduation rates, a 1% increase in math proficiencies, with a 38% funding increase, $500 million. And it just simply didn't make that much of a difference, I mean, really, if any at all. And we can get into that later about how the state manipulates the graduation data.
That
But
actually comes next. Part of the question does come next, but my question is, we're pouring all this money into this, and it seems like a bottomless pit. Obviously, no, we're not getting much bang for our buck. Is it like because we're doing something with education? I don't want to take away from you right this second, but is is it is it systemic? Is it structural, like the curriculum, or is it the educators themselves not relaying it properly, or the teaching methods? I mean, how can we get the most bang for our buck for our kids and the tax dollars?
in January of 2017, when I came to Baltimore, I had already developed a pretty good reputation in Washington, D.C. as an investigative reporter. And when I got here, I had people reaching out to me. People from the school system, people that worked there, people that had recently retired from there, teachers, parents. And what they had said to me was, if you're really going to do this, if you are really going to educate or really going to investigate public education, what you're going to find is that the public education system no longer prioritizes the education of kids. It prioritizes the acquisition of funding and then the usage of that funding to hire additional adults to grow the political power and influence of public education. And at the time in 2017, I rejected that premise because my dad was a public school teacher for 35 years in Pennsylvania. He taught woodshop. I grew up in a woodshop.
My mother's public school teacher.
And then my brother and I went to public schools K through 12. My kids go to public schools. So I really rejected that idea. And the reason that I wrote Failure Factory is because after doing this for 8 or 9 years, I do believe that the evidence suggests that that is true. That the reason that what we're seeing, this massive increase in funding without an increase in educational outcomes, or at least a substantial increase, is because the focus is not on the educational outcomes. The focus is on the acquisition of the funding. And it makes sense. All you got to do is look at the data. 38% funding increase, 1% increase in the graduation rate. And the reason that's happening, and this is over an 8-year period, like this is over an extended period of time, and the reason that's really happening is because the focus isn't on educating the kids. It's on acquiring the funding, because you can see that that's what they're good at, and that's what they're really, really focusing on.
It doesn't surprise me. Follow the money by design, however you want to put it. We're excited. I don't know if you've looked into the American Institute for Civic Leadership. I'm a founding partner of it. It aligns with what we're doing. It's a nonprofit, and we have just finished fully aligning and surpassing the Louisiana curriculum, working with civic educators here in Louisiana. And then they're so excited because they were able to take all their years of experience and not only help me align it. I had a vision and built the skeleton of the curriculum. Then they helped me not only fully align it, but the things that they thought were missing that needed to be expounded on, they put in there as well. And it's really cool because it's introducing American exceptionalism, constitutional thinking constitutionally. Like one side, it introduces civil discourse again. One side of the room in middle school, they're given traditional topic like historical topics. In high school, once they've been trained for debate, they're given hot topics like Supreme Court stuff that's going on in the news right now. And no cursing, no raising voices. The teacher is basically the coach, and she facilitates it. And one side's given the living document side, the other side's given the originalist, so they get to see what resonates. There's also a section for media misinformation. So in middle school, we can start developing informed decisions, because that's where the root is. See, this whole movement came together in 1 week when I was reporting news. 2 polls came out. One said that over 1 in 3 Americans thought it was going to take violence to get us back on track politically. And I said, oh no, we need a nonviolent generational reset. 2, another poll came out and said less than 1 in 5 Americans know the 3 branches of government. I said, oh, that can't be true. So I tested it, but I tested on people with their masters and their doctorates, and they knew 2. They didn't know 3. And I said, this is systemic. This isn't racial. This isn't economic. This is systemic. They are missing this. So we started developing the program, and now we're so excited because the teachers that helped us, it aligns so good that they are using it as supplemental curriculum to teach the whole 6th grade class at my daughter's school.
That has to make you feel great.
Oh man, it makes me feel great. And see, we've implemented now. This is by choice. You don't have to do it, but we're trying to promote responsible AI use, not trying to take the place of people, not making the final decision, but enhancing humans. And we have that in our program, kind of like the Alpha School where Peter Thiel is backing it. We have that in our program because it's been shown that students get to move at their own pace, but they move 10 times faster when they're using AI as a research and a tool. And see, we've built software, AI assisted software, and we call it our federal policy producer. We're scaling it up as an education tool and to use with in the school and also for the American public, because you can take kitchen table discussion. You can take an idea like I wanted to fix gun violence constitutionally. And it spits out Washington ready, sponsor ready legislation that is bipartisan, like it's nonpartisan built. It's built on the with guardrails, data set points, constitutional. It's got to be transparent. It can't be partisan. It's got to be what's best for the American people, and it's built on data points, not donors. So it's built like our healthcare bill. We right now it's in the top bills for Thune and Johnson that we to replace Obamacare and save the American people $2 trillion a year. And literally, if you stay healthy, you get wealthy, no matter what your income range. And we've run all the stress tests against all the other bills that are proposed, and this is the only feasible option. So we're building legislation on data points. But here's the thing: we're going to provide it to the students as a competition tool, and also so they can see how legislation is built and study it in the classroom. And the competition at the end of the year will have a middle school and a high school winner in each state. We'll have parents and kids working to try to fix some of today's issues, biggest issues, and then they'll win a scholarship, and their legislators can decide if they want to take it up in Washington, D.C.
Okay.
To turn get the country active again in constructive, like a constructive way.
Sure. Okay, I understand. I see where you're going with that. I mean, you're thinking outside the box and you're trying to get outside of the cookie cutter approach, the status quo approach that in many ways has taken over public education. And I do think that in doing this for 9 years, that's one of the big problems is that the public education system isn't really interested in changing. And when you look at that, why wouldn't you be interested in changing? Well, because there's an awful lot of people making an awful lot of money in the current system. And
Mm-hmm.
we talked about how Baltimore City Schools got a $500 million pay increase, an annual pay increase over just 8 years. That's over just 8 years. Now, in those years, the school system has hired 1,700 additional employees. The school system now has about 13 or 11,500 people working for it. So when we talked about those math proficiencies and we talked about the graduation rate that I lay out in Failure Factory, you also got to take into consideration that there's 1,700 additional people working for the school system that is also losing enrollment. It's down about 7,000 people, 7,000 kids enrolled. So you got 1,700 more adults that we're told are there to help educate about 7,000 fewer students, and yet the graduation rate still goes up 1% in 8 years, and math proficiencies go up 1% in 8 years. So I think what you're doing is that you are trying to break away from that mold a little bit and try to do something a little bit different that could energize or interest the kids. You know, I'll make this other point here. We've been doing a bunch of stories, Project Baltimore has, Fox 45 has over the past week or so, that dropout rates in Maryland and Baltimore City schools are at 13, 14, 15-year highs. More and more kids are dropping out of high school. And this is detrimental for our community because these are kids that absolutely will not get the skills that they need to be able to compete in the workforce. And we know that. We know what the incarceration rates are as far as people that drop out of school. And we're seeing a huge spike in the people that are dropping out of school. So now, and I'll just end with this segment here. Like, I mean, put this all in perspective. Taxpayers are giving the school system a 38% funding increase in 8 years, and what are we getting back? We're getting 15-year dropout highs, and we're getting graduation rates and math proficiencies that are up 1%. And really, the outcry here and why I wrote this book is so people understand what's going on. Like, this is where your money is going, and this is what you're getting as a result. Where is the outrage?
And it, it, it It really is a shame that I mean, if you took those numbers and you plugged them into a private industry, I've been an entrepreneur for a quarter of a century. Though that would never a 38% spending increase to get a 1% increase in return. That's you know, you can't continue with that. The only way they can continue with that is because they print the money and we continue to pay that never ending spigot, and it just gets poured and poured and poured in there. But I mean, at some point we have to start doing something. This deficit's not going down.
Well, you are seeing that there is a bit of a change. So I think there's around 17 states right now that have started instituting a school choice program. And
Okay.
I'm not suggesting that school choice is the end all be all, but I do think that it could be potentially part of the solution. Because what you have is in Baltimore City, you have kids that can't get out, and their parents may want to get out, but they can't because they don't have the educational or monetary means to escape the schools that they're in. And Maryland does not have a robust school choice program. If you are in a failing school and you don't have the money to leave that jurisdiction, you are stuck in that failing school. And in Failure Factory, I talk to a lot of these parents. I talk to the kids. I talk to the teachers that are in these schools. And every single parent wants better for their kids. And it doesn't matter if you're in the top 1% or the bottom 1%, you want better for your kids. But the difference is people in the top 1%, they can seek out what is better for their kids. The people in the bottom probably 30% can't because they can't afford to. They don't have the money to. And we are seeing this change in America where the school choice movement is starting to gain momentum. And a lot of it is because of places like Baltimore and because of books like Failure Factory that are showing you that year after year, decade after decade, generation after generation, you have these failure factories where these kids go in, they don't get an education, and then you just have perpetual poverty. And it's not my opinion. It's happening. We can see it. It's there. We can look at the data. We know. And we also know it's not working. But yet we continue to do it. And that's why I wrote this book, to try to educate people and open some eyes on how we can change this.
Oh man, I'm glad you did. And I'm glad you're on the show. I've got another question for you. So, and it kind of relates in and ties into what we were talking about just a little earlier. So, you've reported that school systems can manipulate data to hide failure. Walk us through that.
Oh, they very easily can hide the data. So I'll give you an example. So as I said, the book covers 8 years. 5 years of this book involves a grade changing investigation that we had conducted at Fox 45 News. And it started in 2017 when I got to Baltimore and I started doing a bunch of research because that's what investigative reporters do. We look at data and we try to extrapolate stories out of that data and then find the people that make up the data. So what I did was I looked at the 165 schools in Baltimore City and I pulled the state test scores for them. And what I found was there were 6 schools in Baltimore City that did not have any students proficient in any subject. Hundreds of kids, 6 entire schools, no kids proficient in anything. So I had some teachers after that story aired, because it went viral, as you would think it should, and they reached out to me and they said, yeah, this is true, but you realize those kids are still graduating. And I'm like, well, how are they graduating? That doesn't make sense. And the teacher would say, well, because administrators will go into my grade book and they will change failing grades to passing to matriculate the kids through the grades to eventually get them a high school diploma. So I had a number of teachers keep reaching out to me, and I interviewed those teachers, and their testimonies are in Failure Factory. You can read them for yourself, what these teachers are saying, and how administrators are going into their grade book, changing failing grades to passing with the intent to graduate students. So what happened was, I ended up filing a public records request with Baltimore City Schools for information related to this. They denied my public records request. We then sued them. Fox 45 sued Baltimore City Public Schools. In February of 2019, we went to court. I testified for a few hours in front of a circuit court judge. And then in March of 2019, the judge issued her ruling. And her ruling is here for anybody to read, right in the book. And what the judge said was the school system willfully and knowingly violated the law by not handing over public documents. What she said was the school system knew they were breaking the law, but they did it anyway. And in her words, it was to hide potential wrongdoing. So when we ended up getting all the documents from that lawsuit, we got 8,000 emails, we got many internal investigations, and we were able to show that there were more than 12,500 failing grades that were changed to passing so that kids could matriculate through the school system and eventually graduate. And what we learned was upwards of 10% of kids in Baltimore City Schools were graduating that did not earn it. They were given their diplomas through failing grades changed to passing. So that is just one way that schools can manipulate data. They can just change failing grades to passing. Now, if you
Isn't that illegal? I mean, that should be illegal, right? Fraud?
That's exactly what I was going to get to. Nobody was arrested. Nobody was charged.
Nobody's held accountable.
Nobody was charged. In fact, not only was, to my knowledge, nobody held accountable, but the superintendent, which is called a CEO in Baltimore City Schools, the CEO that presided over that is still there. The person who presided over breaking state law to hide documents from the public, she is still the CEO of Baltimore City Public Schools. It's almost too hard to believe, but this is the failure factory. This is why schools like Baltimore, year after year, decade after decade, this is why they don't show academic growth for students, because the decisions, Matt, they're based on the adults, not the students.
And I think if we look, hindsight's always 2020. You can always look back and say, woulda, coulda, shoulda. Well, we have the advantage now of having the technology that can, that's programmed into our technology to look back at all the mistakes made and learn from those mistakes on whatever we're asking you to do. So we have the technology to do that, to figure out what works best, what's most, I think it's just, and that's why, I say that we're building data solutions to re-empower the people. I think it's just, and I also say that it's generational change starts at the top and the bottom meets in the middle. So we got to start grassroots and in Washington with legislation and meet in the middle if we want true change. Because it's ridiculous. We have the technology to show it saves this, this is this. But it's gotten so polarized in DC that it's like literally more about the party than the people. We're not going to vote for this because it'll make this party look good, even though this is what the American people need right now.
I think that we've seen that over the years. Yeah, absolutely. And,
yeah,
a lot of people look at Baltimore City and they say, okay, well, who is outraged about what is happening in the school system? Who is outraged about a 38% funding increase and a 1% increase in the graduation rate? And in a place like Baltimore and in a place like Maryland, when you're talking about the elected officials, the answer is no one. And that's part of the reason that this is happening. And we've been doing this now for 9 years. And when we do these types of stories, 6 schools, no kids proficient in any subject, violations of state law to hide public documents, 12,500 improper grade changes, kids that are graduating who don't deserve it. We do these stories and we don't hear an outcry from the elected officials in Baltimore City. And the obvious next question is, well, why don't you hear an outcry from them? And this is usually how I answer that question, which I think is truthful, is that in places like Maryland and in cities like Baltimore, they are controlled by one political party. And if you want to grow in that political party and you want to advance in that political party, you don't do that by criticizing your own political party. And in Baltimore City, there has not been a Republican elected to city council since the 1930s.
What?
There's not been a Republican elected mayor since the 1960s. So this is a school system that was created and has been run by one political party for 70 years. And if you criticize the school system, you criticize your own political party. Now, I'm not suggesting that Republicans have all the answers, but what I am suggesting is that two-party control is better than one-party rule, because under one-party rule, there's no checks and balances. So that is how you can increase funding by 38%, and you increase graduation rates by 1%, and the leader of that school system keeps her job, making, by the way, $500,000 a year in total compensation.
Oh my gosh, that's freaking more than the president makes, isn't it, or as much?
Oh, more, yeah. It was
Yeah, that's
more than the
more.
president makes. Yeah. Well, it's actually interesting you bring that up because the superintendents of these large school systems, the CEO of Baltimore City Schools makes more than the governor of Maryland. I mean,
That is
it's really it's
that's crazy.
and you start,
That
yeah, you start thinking about all this stuff and you're like, who's setting these salaries?
yeah, that is absolutely crazy. So education is primarily a state and local responsibility under our constitutional structure, but federal funding plays a role. From your reporting, where does federal involvement help and where does it distort incentives?
So a couple months ago, 2 months ago, I interviewed Secretary Linda McMahon of the U.S. Department of Education.
Hmm.
And it was an interesting interview, very respectful, very nice lady. And you know that the president signed an executive order to dismantle the Department of Education. Now,
Hmm.
actually, let me digress here for a second. So last year, when he signed that order to dismantle the Department of Education, when President Trump did, he gave a speech at the White House. And in that speech, he mentioned one school system. He mentioned Baltimore.
Of course.
And what he said was in his speech that in 2023, 40% of the high schools in Baltimore City did not have any students test proficient in math. That's my reporting. That story is in this book. So that story is in my book, Failure Factory. And I don't care who the president is. If the president cites your work as a journalist, that's a pretty cool moment. And the president cited my work in a speech where he didn't cite anybody else's work. So that was a really neat moment for us. So that was my digression there. So now I'm gonna I'm gonna go
No,
back.
it's worth talking about. That's cool.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it was kind of neat. But
Yeah.
but actually back to the point too that when he said that, there was nobody in Baltimore that disputed the fact. It's a fact. You know, we reported it. What they did was they attacked President Trump for talking about it. Talk about our city. And meanwhile, I'm sitting there and he's talking about my reporting, and I'm not putting it on social media. The president's talking about my reporting, and this stat is true. Like we analyzed all the data. Nearly half of the high schools in Baltimore have no kids proficient in math. Anyway, so I was talking to the Secretary of Education, and I asked those same questions. I said, okay, you want to dismantle the Department of Education, and you want to give power back to the states and local municipalities. And the question there is pretty obvious. What happens with a school system like Baltimore that for decades has proven that it's not very good at running itself? And now the federal government wants to get away from that and let the local municipalities control more of what they do when they've already shown they're not good at it. And her answer was this, and it does make sense when you think about it. What she said to me was the U.S. Department of Education does not approve curriculum. Local school systems already approve curriculum. The U.S. Department of Education does not hire any teachers. They do not hire superintendents. They do not hire school board members. They do not discipline children. They do not suspend kids or stop fights or arrest kids in school for bringing in guns or weapons. She's like, we don't do any of that anyway. Her argument was, we already have very little control over what's happening in public education at the local level. What the federal government does is funnel money. And most of the money that it funnels is like Title I schools, high concentration of poverty, and also IDEA, Individuals with Disabilities in Education Act, which would be students with IEPs or students with disabilities. It funnels money to them. But even at that, if there's a dispute of IDEA and parents want to dispute if children are getting the services that they need and deserve, the federal government doesn't even investigate federal law. The state governments investigate federal disability law complaints. So even from that level, the federal government doesn't really do much at all except distribute the money. They also distribute Pell Grants. They do other things like that. They do issue some testing like NAEP, National Assessment of Educational Progress, and Nations Report Card, things like that. So we do get national standards and testing that are coming out of the federal government. But they have very, very little involvement in local education. So what Secretary McMahon is saying is, why are we even here? It doesn't make any sense for us to do what we do. We don't need 4,000 U.S. Department of Education employees to do this work. Because all we're doing is that the U.S. Department of Education is getting the money from the Treasury, and they're siphoning some for their own salaries and their own health care benefits and their own pensions, and then they distribute the rest. And her argument is we can give more money to the local jurisdictions if these 4,000 employees in this department is not here.
I have a question for you that's a little off the cuff here. But with the federal funding, they're still, because I was under the impression that they were trying to dismantle it. So they're still giving funding to institutions, schools, and all that. They're not stepping away from the funding part.
Well, they'd be giving more because the U.S. Department of Education isn't siphoning any of that money for themselves in salaries and benefits and pensions. So more money, under the idea of dismantling the Department of Education, more money is going to go to the local jurisdictions. Now, you're not going to give more money to the U.S. Department of Education. The U.S. Department of Education just isn't going to take any for itself because it's not going to be there. The money is going to be block granted to the states.
Block granted. Okay, so it's not going to be granted from the feds. It's going to be controlled by the states. So it'll be block granted to the states. That's what I was trying to understand.
Yeah.
Okay.
But the states the idea is the states are going to get more money.
Oh no, I understand, because there's nobody that needs. There's no intermediary. There doesn't need to be an intermediary.
There's no third person.
Yes.
Yeah, that's the idea behind it.
Okay, so if we were redesigning this system to produce measurable student outcomes, what are concrete reforms that would move the needle?
So a few things that would happen. So you would have when you talk about that, you would have like policy changes and political changes. So things that happen in the classroom, things that happen outside of the classroom. So things that happen outside of the classroom, the political changes, are pretty simple. In places like Baltimore, as we talked about, the public officials don't hold the school system accountable for student academic outcomes. We simply don't see that. So voters have to vote for people that are going to hold the school system accountable. And what that means is people that are going to hold public office, that are going to take our tax dollars, give it to a school system, and then make sure that those tax dollars are spent to educate our kids. And all the data that we talked about here is saying that the schools are getting a lot more money and the kids aren't increasing their academic performance. Well, you got to have public officials that are going to say, whoa, superintendent, you're going to be fired if our kids don't do better. You, principal, you're going to lose your $170,000 a year job if our kids don't do better. You, assistant principal, you, deputy superintendent, that's what we need. We need to have those types of things in place, those accountability metrics, or else the situation isn't going to improve. And why would it? If you're making nearly $500,000 in total compensation as the CEO of Baltimore City Schools is, and you can go 8 years and get $500 million more for your school and grow your graduation rate by 1%, if that's accepted, why would it ever change? So that's one of the things that we have to do. When we vote for school board, and I think a lot of people, they don't look at school board elections very seriously. They take the presidential election very seriously, but I would argue, unless you're in the military, your local school board has more impact over your life than the president, because your local school board is impacting your property values, it's impacting your taxes, the job market. If you don't have good kids coming out of your school, how's your economy going to grow? That is all your local school board making sure that the local education is where it needs to be. So we need to pay attention to local politics, your state senators, your state representatives, and make sure they're just going to simply watch the school systems, hold them accountable, and make sure that the students are getting what they need. So now we can go to the policy aspect of it. Now the policy aspect gets a little bit more granular. There's simplistic things that can be done, and then there's more difficult things that can be done. The very simplistic thing is, any teacher that you talk to, every teacher I've talked to in 9 years that I talked to in Failure Factory, they're going to say this: the level of discipline in the schools has tanked. Students are not being held accountable for their actions. And what we're seeing is that, we talked about the manipulation of data. Principals and administrators don't want their schools to look dangerous. So they don't want to suspend kids. They don't want to expel kids. They don't want to arrest kids because it makes the school's data look bad. So what they tend to do is look the other way. And they tend not to discipline the kids because they don't want it on the school's record. So what teachers will tell you is that a kid will be misbehaving in their class. They'll send him to the principal's office, and the kid's back the very next period. And then the teacher has to deal with that again. So the very first thing that we have to do is that we have to instill discipline in the schools. And what I mean by that is I don't mean that a kid's acting out and you kick him out of school. What I mean is if a kid's acting out, they have to be removed from the class so that the teacher can teach the kids who want to learn. And then you have to find out what's causing this child to act out. You got to put a little time into it. But the schools do not receive money based on educating kids. And as I'm doing my book tour here and as I'm going around talking to people, that's one of the main things that most people don't realize. And I lay it out in the Failure Factory exactly how this was played out. Schools do not get money to educate students. They get money to enroll students. Schools are funded based on
Numbers.
They're based on enrollment. They're not based on education. So much so that if you have a kid, so in Maryland, enrollment's based on 1 day a year, September 30th. If that kid is enrolled on September 30th, they never have to come to school for the rest of the year, and the school will get 100% of its funding for that kid. They only have to be enrolled 1 day out of 365 days, and the school will get 100% of the funding for that day. So the incentive is to enroll kids. The incentive is not to educate kids. And that's just the way the system was set up. And that's something else that you talked about solutions. That's a potential solution. Let's change the way that schools get their money. Now, that's not to say that if you don't educate the kid, you lose money, but maybe an incentive could be put into place that if you do a really good job educating your kids, maybe you get some extra money and you get rewarded for
Why
that.
wouldn't it just be dispersed quarterly so it could be, or bi-yearly so it could be updated per the students so they wouldn't distribute as much money if they didn't have as many students halfway or a quarter of the way in the year?
All right, man. So what you just said, okay? Where do I start here? Okay, so in Failure Factory, we exposed how this 1 day a year enrollment count is leading to tens of millions of dollars every year going to schools in Maryland that the kids are not attending. And we know it. We know it. It's all Maryland State Department of Education data is showing us. Last year in 1 year, 168 million taxpayer dollars went to schools to educate kids who weren't there because they had left. But because of the 1 day enrollment count, the schools got the money even though the kids left. So after we did that story, some Republican lawmakers got together and they wrote a bill. And the bill said, why don't we count enrollment twice a year?
Or twice, 3 times, whatever, every 3 months.
And in this book, right here, in Failure Factory, I put the responses of the people who opposed the bill in this book. And like the teachers union, for example, Anne Arundel County Public Schools, a large school system in Maryland, wrote me a response saying they oppose the bill because they oppose anything that could reduce their funding. Think about that for a second. We proved that $168 million were going to schools to educate kids who weren't there. And a school system literally wrote us that they're not going to support a bill to change that because they don't want to lose funding. And remember what we talked about in the beginning of your podcast, that the focus is not on educating kids, it's on acquiring money?
Uh-huh.
That email from Anne Arundel County Schools tells you everything that you need to know. Everything you need to know. So the bill died in session, right? Absolutely died. Because the state and the school systems will not support a bill that could potentially cut their funding when we know we as taxpayers are giving millions of dollars to schools to educate kids who aren't there.
So,
That's really all you
so,
need.
so let me ask you this. Uh, what if you come up with a solution that doesn't cut funding but uses it more efficiently?
So what you're saying is the money has to follow the kid. Yeah. So
But
the kid leaves a school, and then the money follows the kid to whatever school they go to.
Well, yeah, and but I'm saying like the structure of it being spent, like instead of yeah, there's got to be like, and I would have to do some research. I mean, this is all off the cuff for me. I'd have to do some research on it. I've got 8 proof of concept legislative bills on the website where we were solving problems in real time. We did a student loan bill that's merit based. Taxpayers should not. The one of the reasons that student loans are going crazy and student education prices, university prices are driving up so much is because these people are getting degrees and not using them and not paying for them, and there's all these student loans. So we did a merit based piece of legislation that basically another thing is we've got outdated tests and outdated teaching methods. So instead of doing this standardized test, we did a merit based piece of legislation where you take a test and it scores you, and depending on what you score, like you can go to school for whatever. But taxpayers aren't going to pay. They will pay if you score 50% proficiency. You qualify for 50% of your tuition paid for through federal funding. And it goes up depending on what proficiency. Instead of people just picking psychology or business or whatever and then not even using it.
Okay, there's a lot to unpack there. So I think what I hear you saying is that you want to have a merit-based system. Okay.
Well, and that was just one of the proof of concepts. Basically the federal policy producer, you can take an idea, you can take data points, you can take a problem, and it designs it on these guardrails that is designed for what's best for the American people, what makes the most sense, taking parties completely out of it. And so it was designed for what would save the American people, what would help combat. So, like, there was a point in time where in real time we were at a little tattoo parlor. My wife wanted to get a cover up before the wedding, which is this weekend. And thank you.
You're getting
And
married this weekend?
yes, and
Congratulations.
thanks, man. We've been planning it for a year. So, anyway, she booked with this girl that was supposed to be really good with vines and stuff to do this cover up. And the girl had a foreign accent. And my wife starts talking to her. She's like, "Where are you from?" The girl's like, "Venezuela." And that's back when Venezuela was all over the news. I'm like, "Wow, your country's in the news." And my wife's like, "Well, how did you end up here?" And she's like, "Well, I came here when I was 17. I came to visit my brother. Going back through the airport, my papers got stolen, and I had 2 choices. I could go back home and never see my brother again, or I could file for asylum, stay here, and never go back home to see my parents again." And I said, "Oh, this is broken. No wonder all this reporting about people being here for 20 years and not becoming a citizen is because they couldn't. This system is broken." So what do? Real time, I feed it into the federal policy producer and spit out legislation for a true pathway to citizenship. Now it takes 13 years, but you can then travel to your home country. So, real time, we're fixing these issues, and what we're trying to do is scale this up and give it to everyone. So who better to fix everyone's issues than everybody that's going through it? And then what it does, we have a pipeline built to DC. We have a location in DC. We have an educator, an advocate. That's how our healthcare policy is, on the guy's desk. And so, what it does is if you put something in the federal policy producer and it coincides with the last 2 years worth of news cycle, we get the option to push it with our pipeline. But the one unquantifiable factor is passion. It's something might take a lifetime for you to push it, and we're not going to get behind that, but we want to provide you with the information so you can do
Okay. Well, I usually stay in my lane of education, but
it.
I appreciate your passion and your idea to do these things. And that's largely what we were talking about with this $168 million in funding schools for kids who aren't there. And what the bills has said was, and there's a number of bills that have been introduced, and none of them even get out of committee. They get killed very quickly. But it's the reason that they get killed. And the reason is what the school system said. We're not going to support anything that lowers our funding. And that's not fair to taxpayers. It's also not fair to the students because the students are moving somewhere and the money's not following them. Or the kids are dropping out of school and they're never coming back. But yet taxpayers are still giving the school money to educate kids who have dropped out. And these are the things, and we kind of started getting on this because you asked what the solutions are, and there's policy solutions, and there's political solutions, but it seems like these solutions don't favor the adults in the school system, so they don't get passed. And we originally started by saying that in the 9 years that we've been doing this, the focus appears to be on not educating kids, but acquiring the funding. So if a bill or a policy doesn't result in more funding, it's unlikely to get passed. And we talked about, why won't schools hold kids accountable and for their actions, which is probably the biggest issue that we hear about in schools: bullying, violence, and kids acting out, and teachers can't teach. Well, I mentioned that principals and administrators don't want it on their record of having a suspension or a fight or something like that. But the other reason is, how do schools get funded? Enrollment. So the schools aren't going to do things that can potentially affect their enrollment. They don't want to suspend kids because the kid may not come back. And now what? Now you're not going to get that money the next year because the student's no longer enrolled. So the incentive is to enroll. The incentive is not to do things to better educate. And those are the conversations that we need to be willing to have. How do we incentivize schools to want to educate kids, not just enroll them? Now, with that said, there are many people in public education that are self-motivated, and they're going to do what they can for kids anyway. And God bless those people. But we can see through a lack of student academic achievement over the past 5, 10, 15 years that that's simply not the norm, because the incentive to educate kids isn't there, and we're seeing it in the lack of academic outcomes.
So, and absolutely, I want to rewind just for a second, because when I was mentioning the legislation, it wasn't to take us off topic. I was actually going somewhere with it. So, so the legislation that's been built, some of them, like the healthcare, actually started with a podcast episode and a podcast guest called Fixing America. Because when I built the software, it was initially not to scale up. It was just to do our flagship legislation for a constitutional quality control board. And for laws to have to go anyway, it was to do the flagship legislation. It's too complicated to get into. But when I did it, then I had a guest on. We were doing a Fixing America series. He came on. He was he's a old political thought leader. He developed Giants of Political Thought back in 1985, the old audio books with Thomas Paine and all that. So he comes on, and we're supposed to theoretically be fixing something. And it was government employee unions. And then he goes into healthcare and ties them in. Well, he has these data points, and I'm like, well, shoot, why don't we use the federal bill policy producer that I've built? So we put his data points in, and we spit out this healthcare thing. And so what I was getting at is, if you have some solutions, we don't have it scaled up right now. The only access is I'm kind of the portal at this point. So the only access is through me. But what I was going to suggest, or not suggest, but offer, is we could feed what is going on, what the problem is, and ask for a solution, and get legislation, real-time legislation written. It's not written in a partisan way. So literally it would go through, if we need to troubleshoot and figure out a way to write legislation where it does not cut spending and it doesn't violate anything constitutional, but it still makes things more proficient, it would do that. So, if you'd like me to do that, you can provide the information, after we get off the show, and I can send you a, Washington formatted bill from our bill proposal, proof of concept, on this end.
Okay, I think we can talk about that offline. I'm interested.
Yeah.
I'm interested to see what it would come up with, because I think that there are solutions that can help. Probably is getting people on board with it, especially when you have school systems that aren't going to agree to anything that could potentially cut their funding. When that is where you start, it's really hard to move on from that point.
Well, but here's the thing: looking at it from a business, standpoint, like if you were to come in and lean up a company, you could take the same amount of funding, but do 10 times more with it if things were built proficiently, and that's where I think there's got to be a happy median. I just don't know enough about the topic to talk about it at this point.
Well, you should read Failure Factory.
Yes.
So read Failure Factory, and then have me back on the show. And I think at that point, I think that we could really start talking about a lot of solutions and potentials.
I don't know, okay, we might could do a part two. Absolutely. Yeah, that would be okay. So I got a couple more questions. Are you good?
Yeah, I got a few
All
more.
right. All right. So for parents listening around the country, what warning signs should they look for in their own districts? What questions should they be asking at school board meetings?
Okay. So in Failure Factory, I have a whole section that is devoted to just that, showing people all around the country what they should be looking for in their school systems. And one of the things that I do is I lay out school board policy, which is probably the least interesting topic in America, is public school board policy. But within those policies in your school board, there's really important language that can tell you a lot about your district. And I lay them out. And one of the things for people to look for is something called the 50% rule. And I take the 50% rule that's in Baltimore City Public Schools policy, and I show you exactly what it looks like along with other policies. So what the 50% rule says is that a student cannot get below a 50% half credit for a semester or marking period grade. It doesn't matter if they never come to school, they never have to turn in a test, they never have to take a test or do homework or take a quiz. They will get a 50. And in Baltimore City Schools, the minimum grade for passing, a D minus, is a 60. So on a 100-point scale, kids in Baltimore City Public Schools only have to actually gain 10 points because they're automatically given 50 points. So why did the school system pass this? The school system passed this policy because they wanted more kids to pass. Too many kids were failing. And most people listening to us would say, well, wouldn't the solution be to better educate kids? Well, I mean, if the focus of the school system is to educate kids, yeah, that would be the focus. But the focus is not on educating, as one teacher tells me in Failure Factory. The focus is on passing. Pass the kids. We talked about the grade changing scandal. The focus is on passing the kids. And why is the focus on passing? Because the money is related to enrollment. And if you keep passing kids, they're more likely to stay enrolled and the money keeps coming in. So in Failure Factory, I give those types of things and I say if the 50% rule is in your school system, that's an indication that your school system's academics are going down and the school is trying to find a way to pass more kids to make the data look better than it is. You asked me about 30 minutes ago about manipulating data in a school system. This is one of the ways the schools do it. They pass things like the 50% rule, and then they say, look, we have 91% of our kids pass every year. Well, yeah, because you're starting them at a 50, and they only have to earn 10 points to pass the course.
Wow. Okay, if you had to distill 8 years of investigation into one principle, what should Americans understand about how public systems drift away from their intended mission?
It's what we've been talking about, man. It's the school systems, in my experience, and even talking to administrators and teachers and parents and students in Failure Factory, the focus is not the students, the focus is the adults. I just talked to, just a couple days ago, I interviewed the former education chair for the Maryland State Conference NAACP, who endorsed this book, actually wrote the foreword for this book. And what she said was the school systems, when they make decisions with the best interest of the adults being the center point, not the best interest of the students. So this concept is not necessarily new, but what Failure Factory does is it shows you exactly how it's playing out with things like the 50% rule, with things like not disciplining kids when we all know that kids need structure. but the schools aren't doing it because they're afraid that the child could potentially drop out, and now they lose the funding because funding is based on enrollment. We need to get to a point where the schools are making decisions based on the best interest of the students. But as we talked about before, they're not incentivized to do that. They're incentivized to get as many kids enrolled as possible. And I'll make this last point here that I think is really important. And this is 100% true in a state like Maryland and throughout most everywhere in the country. If you're a principal or you're a teacher or you're a superintendent, whether 100% of your kids test proficient in English or 0% of your kids test proficient in English, you get the same amount of money.
Really?
So where's the incentive?
It just seems so backwards. I mean, the teachers are already so underpaid. I mean, we're offering a small stipend, for them reporting back data and all that stuff on teaching the new program, just because we want to give back as much as we can because teachers are so underpaid.
It depends on where you are.
Yeah.
So, there's a lot of teachers in our area that make very good six-figure salaries, and
Oh no, yeah, that don't happen. The beginning salary for a teacher in a lot of these southern states is about 29, 30,000 a year.
so the beginning salary here is 60.
Well, cost of living is a lot higher though.
Yeah, cost of living's higher. That's fair. Yep.
Yeah, cost of living is a lot higher. So, is there anything that we missed before I sign us off?
Nah, man, I think you did a really good job. I hope people pick up a copy of the book. It's called Failure Factory: How Baltimore City Public Schools Deprive Taxpayers and Students of a Future. You can find it anywhere: Barnes and Nobles, Amazon, Goodreads, anywhere books are sold. And I really wrote this book because I want people to understand what's really happening in the public education system, where the money is going, why student outcomes are not improving, and we can fix it. We have to fix it. We can't afford our public education system to keep going down the path it's going down. It's getting too expensive. It's bankrupting municipalities, and we're not benefiting from it because the students aren't getting the proper education.
Absolutely, absolutely. Christopher, thank you for joining the Patriot Party and cutting through all the noise with clarity and practicality. To everyone listening, we'll include information about Christopher's work in the episode description. As always, here at the Patriot Party, our goal is not to tell you what to think, but to help you think clearly, critically, and independently. Remember, America first, not America only, because we lead by example.